Remembers 5,000 years ago, a soft green metal didn't just change tools, it quietly taught humans how to control land, remembers peoples, and violence. By the time they realized what it had unleashed, cities were burning, remembers borders were killing fields, and there was no way back. Remembers, I want to start with a confession. For most of my life, I thought copper was boring, not useless, it was just unremarkable. In my head, human history moved in clean, confident steps. Remembers, stone tools gave way to copper, copper gave way to bronze, bronze gave way to iron. A simple ladder of progress, remembers, each rung slightly better than the last. Copper, in that story, was just an in-between material, remembers, a transitional phase, a footnote between real revolutions. But the more I looked at the evidence, the more that idea began to fall apart, because copper didn't just improve tools. It changed how humans organized themselves. It changed who moved and who stayed. It changed who held power and who paid the price for it. And once I realized that, remembers, I couldn't stop asking a question that still unsettles me. What if the first metal didn't simply make life easier? Remembers, what if it quietly rewired human society in ways we're still living with today? That question is what pulled me into this story. Remembers, not as a historian standing at a distance, not as a narrator reading from a script, but as someone genuinely trying to understand how a dull, green-stained metal could set humanity on a path towards cities, remembers, war, collapse, and empire. Welcome to Empire's Historical. And before we go any further, remembers, let me tell you something important. This is not a story about dates and artifacts alone. This is a story about choices, remembers, about trade-offs, about how technology shapes human behavior long before anyone realizes what it's doing. Remembers, because copper doesn't arrive with fanfare. It arrives quietly, as native nuggets scattered across hills and riverbeds. Remembers, as strange stones that behave differently under a hammer, stones that don't shatter, stones that bend. Remembers, that single property malleability was revolutionary. For the first time, tools didn't have to be thrown away when they broke, but they could be reshaped, repaired, improved, reused. That sounds small. Remembers, it wasn't because the moment tools become repairable, they become investments. And the moment people invest in tools, they begin to think differently about time, labor, and control. Copper didn't just change what people made. Remembers, it changed how they planned. And planning, as it turns out, is where power begins. Remembers, at first, copper objects were humble, beads, pins, small implements. Remembers, nothing that screams dominance or conquest. No armies marching behind them, no kings rising with copper crowns. Remembers, but within a few thousand years, copper would be tied to fortified settlements, long-distance trade networks, organized violence, and the collapse of entire societies. That escalation didn't happen by accident. Remembers, it followed a pattern. And once I started tracing that pattern, it became impossible to ignore. Remembers, here's the first surprise. Some of the most sophisticated copper-using societies in the ancient world were not violent, meant expansionist empires. They didn't build monumental palaces or bury their elites under mountains of gold. Remember, instead, they built systems. One of the clearest examples comes from the Indus Valley, from cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. These places were enormous by ancient standards. Remembers, tens of thousands of people living together, dense urban layouts, advanced sanitation. Remembers, precise brick dimensions repeated over hundreds of miles. And yet, there's something almost unsettling about them. Remembers, there are no obvious kings. No massive temples dominating the skyline. No tombs filled with weapons claiming absolute authority. Power in Harappa doesn't shout. It whispers. It hides in standardized weights, in consistent alloy recipes. Remembers, in neighborhoods organized by craft and function, copper, in this world, is not a weapon first. It is a tool of coordination. And coordination, when it works, is incredibly powerful. Remembers, but that raises a question that wouldn't let me go. If copper could support a society built on standardization, remembers, cooperation, and relative balance, why didn't the rest of the world follow that path? As the answer lies in what happens when copper leaves the city grid, when it stops anchoring people to infrastructure and starts traveling with them instead. Because elsewhere, remembers, especially in Europe, copper becomes something else entirely. It becomes personal. Around 2800 BC, remembers, a distinctive cultural package appears across vast stretches of the continent. Bell-shaped pottery, remembers, copper daggers, stone wrist guards, ornament sets so standardized they look almost mass-produced. Remembers, they don't spread slowly. They appear suddenly. In regions separated by hundreds, sometimes thousands of kilometers. Remember, this isn't just cultural influence. It looks like people moving. Groups carrying skills, remembers, identities, and technologies with them. Teaching metalworking techniques locally, men producing copper weapons close to where they settle. Here, Copper is no longer primarily about maintaining order, it's about mobility. And once mobility enters the equation, everything changes, remembers, because mobile societies don't rely on walls. They rely on what they can carry, what they can repair, remembers, what they can defend. A copper dagger, small as it is, can be reforged. A stone blade cannot, remembers. That difference accumulates over time. It rewards adaptability. It favors those who survive repeated conflict. Remember shapes social status around skill and violence, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, a new figure emerges. The warrior. Not a king, not yet, but someone whose identity is inseparable from metal. This is where the story begins to darken, remembers, because once copper becomes a personal asset, something buried with the dead, worn as a marker of status, remembers, carried as a tool of survival, it stops being neutral. It becomes contested, and contested resources invite conflict for a long time. This part of the story still felt distant to me. Archaeological cultures, remembers, migration patterns, weapon typologies, until I encountered a single body in the Alps, remembers, a man who died over 5,000 years ago. His name, we now know, was Ortsai. He wasn't a ruler, he wasn't an emperor, but he carried a copper axe, members, and that axe came from more than 200 kilometers away, across mountain passes that were dangerous even in peacetime. Remembers that Sai died from an arrow shot into his back while he was fleeing uphill. That detail matters. It tells this wasn't an accident. Remembers, it wasn't a ritual killing. It wasn't random violence. It was an ambush. And ambushes are strategic. Remembers, suddenly, the Copper Age stopped being an abstract period of technological experimentation. It became human. Remembers, immediate, violent. Copper had turned territory into something worth killing for. Mountain passes, remembers, trade routes, resource zones. Once metal gives those places value, societies reorganize around controlling them. Remembers, that's the threshold. The moment conflict stops being occasional and becomes structural. And once that happens, remembers, copper is no longer enough. Because copper bends, copper dulls, copper fails under sustained pressure. Remembers, when survival depends on decisive advantage, people don't retreat from technology. They escalate. Remembers, they experiment. They look for something stronger. That search leads to bronze. And bronze doesn't just improve weapons. Remembers, it changes the rules of power entirely. If you want to understand why cities rose and fell, why wars became organized, remembers, why empires became possible at all, you have to start here, not with kings or armies, remembers, but with the first metal humans learned to control. If this journey interests you, remembers, if you want to follow this story all the way to its unsettling conclusion, consider subscribing to Empire's Historical. Remembers, it helps the channel grow, and it allows us to keep exploring the moments in history that quietly shape the world we live in today. Remembers, because copper didn't just change the past, it taught humanity how power works. And once that lesson is learned, it can never be forgotten. Remembers, if copper, in its earliest chapters, taught humans how power could emerge, remembers, then the cities of the Indus Valley show us something far more unsettling. Power does not always need kings to exist. Remembers, when I first turned my attention toward Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, I expected to find the familiar signs of ancient authority. Remembers, a palace, a throne room, a dominant temple towering over the city like a declaration of control. But the deeper I looked, the stranger the silence became. These were not small villages experimenting with metal. Remembers, these were vast urban systems, some of the largest the world had ever seen at the time. Tens of thousands of people living together. Remembers, streets laid out in precise grids, brick sizes standardized across regions hundreds of miles apart. Remembers, drainage systems so sophisticated that many wouldn't be matched again for millennia. And yet, no obvious rulers. Remembers, no monumental tomes, no royal inscriptions proclaiming conquest or divine right. At first, this absence feels almost comforting. Remembers, tempts us into believing that Harappan society represents a peaceful alternative to the violence unfolding in the Copper Age world. Remembers, a civilization that mastered metal without letting it master them. But that impression doesn't last. Remembers, because power doesn't disappear just because it doesn't wear a crown. In Harappa, power simply learned how to hide. Remembers, one of the first clues lies in how the cities were organized. These weren't chaotic settlements that grew organically over time. Neighborhoods were structured around specific economic activities. Entire districts dedicated to metalworking. Remembers, others to pottery, others to bead production. Agricultural storage zones carefully separated from residential areas. Remembers, this level of spatial planning requires coordination, not suggestions, not casual agreements. Coordination enforced consistently across generations. Copper, here, was not scattered experimentation. Remembers, it was systematized production, and systems require oversight. Remembers, what fascinated me most was how little room Harappan cities left for individual improvisation. Bricks followed exact proportions, weights followed strict binary ratio. Remembers, alloy compositions were consistent enough that archaeologists can identify standardized recipes across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers. That kind of uniformity doesn't emerge from spontaneous cooperation alone. It emerges when deviation becomes costly. Remembers, when producing copper tools. For example, consistency matters. Remembers, a chisel that bends too easily or a blade that snaps under pressure doesn't just fail the craftsman, it disrupts the workflow of everyone downstream. Remembers, the builder waiting for materials, the farmer needing tools repaired, the trader depending on predictable quality. Copper appears less as a symbol of dominance and more as a stabilizing agent, something that holds the system together by rewarding reliability and punishing error. Remembers, but stability always has a price, and in this case, the price was flexibility. Harappan society seems to have invested deeply in predictability, in repeatable processes. Remembers, in administrative routines that could scale across a massive population without relying on charismatic leaders or overt force. That choice shaped everything. It shaped how labor was divided. Craftsmen weren't independent artists producing for personal status. Remembers, they were part of production chains. Metal workers depended on standardized fuel supplies. Smelters depend on consistent ore sources. Finishers depended on established tool forms that matched existing handles, molds, and expectations. Remembers, this wasn't craftsmanship driven by individual expression. It was craftsmanship embedded in bureaucracy. And while that system produced remarkable results, durable tools, efficient urban life, long-distance trade also created fragility. Remembers, because when everything depends on coordination, even small disruptions can cascade. What strikes me most is how Harappan inequality expresses itself. There are differences. Yes, remember, some houses are larger, some have private wells, some connect more directly to drainage systems. Remembers, luxury goods, beads, finely worked copper objects. Exotic materials are not evenly distributed, but there is no explosion of elite display. No graves overflowing with weapons and gold. Remembers, no visible warrior class asserting dominance through burial rituals. This tells us something important. Remembers, Harappan elites, if we can call them that, did not legitimize themselves through violence or spectacle. Remembers, their authority likely rested on their role within the system: administrators, coordinators, intermediaries. Remembers, people who controlled flows rather than territory. Copper enabled that control. Remembers, not because it was scarce though it was valuable, but because it required expertise to manage properly. Mining. Remembers, smelting, alloying, casting, finishing. Remembers, each step demanded knowledge that could not be easily replicated without training. That knowledge became a quiet form of power. Remembers, and quiet power is often the most durable until conditions change. By around 1900 BC, cracks begin to appear. Remembers, the cities don't burn in dramatic conquest. They don't collapse overnight under invading armies. Instead, remembers, they thin out. Neighborhoods empty gradually. Workshops produce lower quality metal objects. Remembers, standardization weakens. Brick sizes vary. Alloy compositions become inconsistent. To me, this is one of the most haunting aspects of Harappa's decline. Not violence but exhaustion. Remembers, environmental pressures likely played a role. River systems shifted. Flood patterns changed. As agricultural yields became less predictable. A system optimized for stability struggles when variability increases. As trade networks once carefully balanced begin to strain. When copper sources become harder to access. Remembers, when fuel becomes scarcer. When administrative coordination falters. The entire machine slows. Remembers, machines that slow don't always stop gracefully. They grind. But the final copper and bronze objects from Harappan contexts tell a quiet story of decline. Tools are still made, remembers, but with less care, less precision, less consistency. It's as if the knowledge is still there, remembers, but the institutional scaffolding that once supported it has begun to dissolve. This isn't a failure of intelligence. It's a failure of adaptability. Remembers, Harappa shows us that copper can support a remarkably balanced society, but only as long as the conditions that sustain coordination remain intact. Once those conditions change, the same systems that once prevented inequality can prevent recovery. Remembers, and this is where the Copper Age story takes a sharp turn. Because while Harappa was doubling down on stability, remembers, the rest of the world was learning something very different. They were learning how to move, remembers. They were learning how to carry copper with them. They were learning how to survive without cities. In the next chapter of this story, remembers, we leave the grid-patterned streets of the Indus Valley behind and follow copper as it travels across Europe, not as an administrative tool, remembers, but as a personal weapon, a cultural marker, and eventually, a catalyst for conflict. Remembers, and the contrast could not be more stark. Because where Harappa trusted systems, others trusted strength. Remembers, and copper, it turns out, could serve both, just not forever. Remembers, if Harappa represents a world that tried to preserve balance through systems and coordination, remembers, then what happens next in Europe feels almost like a rejection of that choice. As I followed copper westward and northward, remembers, away from the planned streets and standardized bricks of the Indus Valley, I began to sense a different rhythm entirely. Remembers, this was not a story of cities tightening their grip on order. It was a story of movement, remembers, of people who did not anchor themselves to infrastructure, but carried their identities, technologies, remembers, and ambitions with them. Around the late 4th millennium BC, something remarkable begins to unfold across Europe. Across landscapes separated by mountains, rivers, and seas, a recognizable material language suddenly appears. Remembers, bell-shaped pottery, copper daggers, stone wrist guards, sets of ornaments that seem to follow shared rules of design. Remembers, what unsettles me is not what these objects are but how quickly they appear. Remembers, this not the slow diffusion of ideas passing hand to hand over centuries. It is abrupt, almost synchronized. Remembers, from the Iberian Peninsula to Central Europe, from the British Isles to the Western Mediterranean. Remembers, communities that had never shared borders suddenly begin to speak the same material language. That kind of spread does not happen by accident. It suggests people moving, groups relocating, intermarrying, forming alliances. Remembers, carrying not just objects but skills, knowledge that could not be reverse engineered easily. Remembers, techniques for working copper into reliable weapons, methods for shaping pottery that balanced aesthetics with durability. Remembers, practices passed from teacher to apprentice, parent to child. This phenomenon, remembers, which archaeologists call the bell beaker culture, marks a profound shift in how copper functioned within society. Remembers, in Harappa, copper belonged to the system. Here, copper belongs to the individual. Remembers, a bell beaker copper dagger is not a tool stored in a communal workshop. It is small enough to be worn, remembers, carried, buried with its owner. It is personal property in a way earlier copper objects rarely were. Remembers, and that changes everything, because once copper becomes personal, it becomes portable. Remembers, and once it is portable, it becomes a marker of identity. These daggers were not crude imitations of foreign designs. Remembers, they were carefully made, flat blades, often 8 to 15 centimeters long, with tangs that required precise coordination between metalworkers and handle makers. This was not casual metallurgy. Remembers, it required casting, finishing, and controlled heat treatment. At workshops in places like southeastern Spain, remembers, we find stone molds designed specifically for producing standardized dagger forms. Crucibles, furnaces, evidence of repeatable process. Remembers, this tells us that bell beaker communities were not just using copper, they were mastering it in ways that exceeded earlier European traditions. Remembers, but unlike Harappa, this mastery was not centralized. It was replicated. Remembers, local craftsmen produced these objects using locally sourced materials, but following shared traditions. That combination, local production, global style, is powerful. Remembers, it allows culture to spread without dependence on a single political center. And it allows identity to travel. The pottery tells the same story. Bell-shaped vessels, typically 15 to 20 centimeters tall, remembers, decorated with geometric patterns impressed before firing. These motifs are remarkably consistent across regions, remembers, yet each carries subtle local variation. This tells us something important. Bell beaker culture was enforced by authority. It was chosen. People adopted it because it conferred meaning, belonging, status. Light, remembers, and status, in this context, begins to intertwine with violence. Remembers, one of the most striking artifacts associated with bell beaker burials is the stone wrist guard. Rectangular plaques, as carefully shaped and polished, perforated for fastening to the forearm. At a basic level, meant they protected archers from bowstring impact. Remembers, but protection alone does not explain the care invested in their manufacture or their frequent placement in high-status graves. Remembers, these were not just tools, they were symbols. They told a story about who the deceased was or want to be remembered as. Remembers, a skilled archer, a mobile warrior, someone capable of defending themselves and their kin in a world where movement meant exposure. Remembers, because mobility is liberating but it is also dangerous. Highly mobile societies cannot rely on walls. Remembers, they cannot depend on stored surplus alone. They must defend themselves wherever they go. And copper made that possible, not because it was invincible, but because it was repairable. A damaged copper weapon could be reforged. Remembers, a broken stone blade was simply gone. That difference compounds over time. It favors those who survive repeated conflict. It rewards experience. It elevates warriors. Remembers, this is where the story begins to converge with another cultural current spreading across Europe at roughly the same time. The corded ware culture. While bell beaker groups expanded rapidly across Western and Central Europe, remembers, corded ware communities established themselves across a vast east-west corridor stretching from the Rhine Valley to the Volga River. Their pottery, decorated with cord-impressed patterns, reflects a different aesthetic tradition, but the underlying social dynamics feel eerily similar. Corded ware metalworkers developed their own metallurgical specialties, most notably shaft-hole axes. Remembers, these were not simple tools. They required advanced casting techniques to create both the external form and the internal socket needed for hafting. Producing such an object demands precise control. Clay cores positioned within stone molds, careful pouring of molten copper, an understanding of cooling rates to prevent cracking. The resulting axes were heavy, durable, and effective, typically weighing between 200 and 400 grams. Remembers, they represented a significant leap in European metal tool design. And once again, we see standardization. Axes from distant sites share proportions, dimensions, and design logic. Remembers, this tells us that knowledge was moving across space not slowly, but through active networks of exchange. Remembers, copper ore sourced from regions like the Slovak mountains traveled hundreds of kilometers, finished tools in multiple directions. Remembers, following demand patterns shaped by both practical needs and social preferences. These were not isolated cultures, as they were interacting. In fact, remembers, some of the most revealing archaeological contexts come from hybrid sites where bell beaker and corded ware traditions overlap. Remembers, burials containing both cord-decorated pottery and bell-shaped vessels. Copper objects that blend stylistic elements from both traditions. Remembers, these assemblages tell us that cultural boundaries were permeable. People married across groups, traded, shared techniques, adopted symbols selectively. Copper, once again, remembers, acts as the medium through which these interactions become visible. But this connectivity comes at a cost. As copper becomes central to identity and survival, competition intensifies. Remembers, we begin to see fortified settlements appear across Europe, hilltops enclosed by earthworks. Remembers, defensive ditches and ramparts carefully engineered to channel attackers into vulnerable positions. These are not temporary refuges, they are long-term investments. At sites like Maiden Castle in southern England, early defensive earthworks date to around 2500 BC, multiple lines of ramparts, strategic positioning overlooking key roads. Remembers, clear evidence that communities were planning for sustained conflict. Copper weapons appear alongside these fortifications. Remembers, arrowheads, spears, axes, and importantly, remembers, we begin to see evidence of organized violence not just in weapons but in bodies. Mass graves, remembers, healed fractures, embedded projectiles. At Tolheim in Germany, remembers, archaeologists uncovered a mass grave containing 34 individuals, men, women, and children killed by systematic violence. Remember, stone axes and arrows were used, suggesting attackers without access to copper weaponry. This detail matters. Remembers, it shows that unequal access to metal technology could decide the outcome of entire conflicts. Copper was no longer just an advantage, it was a dividing line. Those who controlled copper sources, trade routes, remembers, and metallurgical knowledge could dominate those who did not. And slowly, almost inevitably, a new social category emerges: the warrior elite. These were not kings in the later Bronze Age sense. Remembers, they were not bureaucrats or priests. Their authority came from demonstrated capability, from access to superior weapons. Remembers, from the ability to protect or threaten. Their graves tell the story. Standardized sets of equipment. Remembers, copper daggers, wrist guards, archery gear, objects designed for use, not just display. As at sites like Singen in southern Germany, a burial dating to around 2700 BC contains exactly such an assemblage. Remembers, a complete warrior's kit, portable, functional, lethal. If this is a different vision of power than Europus, remembers, not stability through coordination, but dominance through readiness. And copper made it possible. Remembers, yet even here, copper has limits. It bends, it dulls, it struggles under sustained pressure. Remembers, as conflicts grow larger and more organized, societies begin to push metalworking further. They experiment with alloys, remembers, with new techniques, with harder, more reliable materials. The stage is being set for something new, and as we move into the high mountains of the Alps, into the life and death of a single man caught in these transformations, remembers, the consequences of copper's spread become impossible to ignore. Because in the next chapter of this story, remembers, the Copper Age stops being about cultures and patterns. It becomes personal, it becomes violent, and it leaves behind a body frozen in ice, carrying the weight of an entire era on his back. As copper reshaped identities, warfare, and power across Europe, remembers, its consequences became impossible to ignore. Once we narrow our focus from cultures and migrations down to a single human life, remembers, high in the Alps, far above the valleys where settlements clustered and trade routes branched, remembers, the Copper Age left behind one of its most haunting witnesses. For more than 5,000 years, he lay frozen in silence. But when hikers discovered his body in 1991, melting out of glacial ice near a high mountain pass, Remembers they did not yet know that they were looking at the most intimate record of violence, technology, remembers, and survival from the Copper Age ever found. We now call him Otzi, but long before he became a scientific icon, remembers, he was simply a man moving through dangerous territory, carrying everything he owned on his back. What struck me most, remember the first time I truly examined Otzi's story, was not how well preserved his body was, remembers, it was how intentional everything about his life appeared. Nothing he carried was accidental. Nothing was ornamental without purpose. Remembers, every object tells us something about the world Copper had created around him. Otzi lived around 300 BC, remembers, during a period when alpine regions were no longer peripheral spaces. They had become strategic zones, cones linking north and south, remembers, choke points controlling trade, and repositories of valuable copper ore. The Alps were not empty wilderness. Remembers, they were contested terrain. Moving through them required knowledge, planning, and constant readiness for violence. Remember, CS copper axe alone tells us this. It is the oldest complete copper axe ever discovered, remembers, and it is a masterpiece of Copper Age engineering. The blade, cast from copper containing trace amounts of arsenic, is harder and more durable than pure copper. Remembers, its composition shows that metallurgists already understood how small changes in alloy chemistry could dramatically alter performance. But what matters just as much as the blade is where it came from. Remembers, chemical analysis reveals that the copper used in Otzi's axe originated from the Mitterberg region of Austria more than 200 kilometers away, where that distance is not trivial. Transporting a finished metal object across rugged mountain terrain requires established trade networks, remembers, reliable roads, and social agreements that allow passage through multiple valleys controlled by different groups. Otzi was not isolated. He was connected to a larger system, and that system was under strain. The axe itself was hafted with remarkable sophistication. A yew-wood handle, carefully shaped, remembers, birch tar adhesive securing the blade, leather bindings reinforcing the joint. This was not a simple tool, remembers, it was the product of multiple crafts: metallurgy, woodworking, chemistry, leatherworking. Copper had woven these specializations together, and it had made Otzi dangerous. Remembers, in a world where stone tools still dominated many communities, a copper axe was not just an advantage. Remembers, it was a signal. It marked its owner as someone with access to materials, to knowledge, remembers, to networks. That kind of access creates envy. It creates fear. And it creates targets. Remembers, Otzi's equipment tells us he knew this. He did not travel lightly. He carried a copper knife, remembers, frequently resharpened, its edge worn by repeated use. He carried a bow, unfinished but clearly in the process of being repaired or replaced. He carried a quiver with 14 arrows, only 2 of them completed. Remembers, that detail is chilling. An archer does not normally travel with incomplete arrows unless something has gone wrong. It suggests recent conflict, a depletion of supplies, a need to improvise under pressure. His clothing reinforces this picture of constant readiness. Leather leggings, a bearskin cap, remembers, shoes insulated with grass for warmth and traction, a grass cloak designed to be shed quickly if rapid movement became necessary. Remembers, this was not ceremonial dress. This was survival gear. Even his medical knowledge reflects the reality of violence. Remembers, Otzi's body bears 61 tattoos, small incisions rubbed with charcoal placed primarily over joints and roots associated with chronic strain and injury. Remembers, many align with acupuncture points recognized today. These were not decorative. They were therapeutic. Remembers, they suggest a community that understood pain management, likely developed through generations of physical stress. Remembers, combat injuries, and harsh living conditions. Copper technology did not eliminate suffering. Remembers, it intensified it. The contents of Otzi's stomach provide one final glimpse into his last hours. Incorn wheat, remembers, red deer meat, ibex fat, a carefully balanced meal, not the food of someone fleeing in panic without preparation. Remembers, he had stopped. He had eaten, which means he believed, at least briefly, that he was safe. Remembers, the arrow that killed him shattered that illusion. It struck him from behind, entering his left shoulder at an upward angle. Remembers, the wound severed major blood vessels, causing rapid blood loss. The trajectory tells us something important. His attacker was below him, and Otzi was running uphill. This was not a duel. This was a pursuit. Remembers, the attacker was an experienced archer, capable of making an accurate shot under difficult conditions and even terrain. Remembers, thin air, moving target. This was mountain warfare, and mountain warfare is unforgiving. Remembers, what makes Otzi's death so unsettling is how ordinary it appears within the broader Copper Age context. There is no evidence of ritual sacrifice. Remembers, no sign of execution, no ceremonial burial. He was ambushed, wounded, and left where he fell. Remembers, his death fits a pattern. Across the Alps during this period, fortified settlements appear with increasing frequency. Remembers, palisades, earthworks, Stone walls positioned to control valley access and mountain passes. At sites like Arbon, Blach in Switzerland, remembers, lakeside settlements were surrounded by defensive structures incorporating copper-tipped stakes and barriers designed to slow attackers. Remembers, these were not symbolic defenses. They were practical responses to real threats. Remembers, the competition for control over copper sources and trade routes had escalated beyond sporadic raiding. It had become territorial warfare. Remembers, mining sites themselves became targets. The Mitterberg mining complex shows evidence of intensive exploitation during this period. Remember, shafts extending over 100 meters into mountainsides. Timber support systems engineered to prevent collapse. Remembers, ore processing installations capable of handling large volumes. These were strategic assets. Protecting them required force, and force reshaped leadership. In alpine regions, we begin to see the emergence of war leaders, individuals capable of organizing defense, coordinating raids, remembers, and controlling movement through valleys. Their authority did not come from lineage alone. It came from success, remember, from survival, from violence. Or Tutsi may not have been a chief, but he was clearly someone of importance. Remembers, his copper axe alone would have made him a figure of status. His knowledge of roads, his equipment, remembers, his preparedness all suggest a man accustomed to danger. And that danger was not accidental. At Aspansets in Austria, remembers, archaeologists uncovered the remains of over 60 individuals killed during a systematic attack around the same period as Altsai's death. Remembers, the victims show evidence of blunt force trauma, arrow wounds, and execution-style injuries. Remembers, was not a skirmish, it was a massacre. Entire communities were being wiped out. The weapons used, copper axes, remembers, arrows. Clubs reflect an escalation in both technology and tactics. Remembers, alpine copper axes from this period are heavier than their lowland counterparts, designed to deliver force against stone, remembers, wood, and bone in confined terrain. Their hafting systems are reinforced. Their handles longer. Their balance optimized for repeated strikes. This is metallurgy shaped by violence, where defensive architecture evolves alongside weaponry. At hilltop settlements like Stilford in Austria, remembers, multiple defensive lines funnel attackers into narrow passages where defenders could concentrate fire using copper-tipped arrows and spears. Remembers, these designs show strategic thinking. They show planning. They show that warfare was no longer reactive. It was anticipated. And anticipation changes everything. It requires leadership structures that transcend kinship, as it demands coordination across households and generations. It transforms communities into military units. Remembers, the Alps, once a corridors, became a battleground. Climate pressure only intensified this reality as temperatures began to decline and agricultural zones contracted. Access to productive valleys became more competitive. Remembers, groups pushed against one another, defending what little arable land remained. Movement became riskier. Trust became scarce. Violence became normalized. And yet, even in this environment, remembers, trade did not disappear. Sea ice flint arrowheads came from northern Italy. Remembers, his copper blade reflects alloying knowledge likely shared across regions. His equipment shows a blend of cultural influences. Remembers, this tells us something crucial. Conflict and connectivity coexisted. Remembers, the same networks that enabled trade also created vulnerabilities. Supply lines could be disrupted. Remembers, routes ambushed. Alliances broken. Otzi may have been attempting to use a lesser-known pass to avoid interception. If so, he failed, and his failure preserved his story for us. But what haunts me most about Otzi is not how he died but how recognizable his situation feels. Remembers, a man carrying valuable technology through contested territory. A world where innovation offers advantage but also paints a target. Remembers, a landscape where survival depends on preparation, alliances, and the willingness to fight. Remembers, this is not a distant past. It is a pattern humanity would repeat again and again. Copper did not create violence. Remembers, but it reorganized it. It made conflict strategic. It made territory valuable. It made power portable. Remembers, and in the frozen body of a man who never reached his destination, we see the human cost of that transformation. Because Otzi was not an emperor. He was not a conqueror. Remember, he was simply someone living at the edge of a technological revolution that had outpaced humanity's ability to control its consequences. Remember, as we move forward into the final chapter of this story, remembers, we will see how those consequences did not end with copper but pushed the ancient world towards something harder. Remembers, deadlier and far more transformative, bronze. Remembers, frozen body shows us the human cost of copper in its most intimate form. Remembers. Then what follows is the moment when societies decide that copper is no longer enough. By the late 3rd millennium BC, remembers, something had shifted across the ancient world. Not suddenly, not everywhere at once, but unmistakably. Remembers, communities that had spent generations refining copper tools, weapons, remembers, and trade networks began to encounter the limits of the metal that had carried them this far. Copper bent too easily in sustained combat. Remembers, it dulled too quickly under repeated use. It demanded constant repair in a world that was becoming increasingly violent. Remembers, competitive and unstable. And so people began to experiment not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. They added small amounts of other metals, at first unintentionally, then deliberately. Remembers, arsenic, antimony, eventually tin. What they discovered changed everything. Remembers, tin bronze was harder, more durable, more predictable. Remembers, it could be cast into complex shapes without the brittleness that plagued earlier alloys. It held an edge longer. It resisted corrosion. And perhaps most importantly, remembers, its properties could be reproduced consistently if you had access to tin and knew the right ratios. Remembers that if mattered more than anyone realized at the time, because tin was rare, copper was relatively widespread. Remembers, tin was not. It existed in scattered deposits Cornwall, Bohemia, Central Asia. Remembers, parts of Anatolia often far from population centers, often in politically unstable or environmentally harsh regions. The moment bronze proved superior, the logic of power changed. Remembers, control over tin routes became more important than control over copper mines. And control over routes meant control over people. Remembers, what fascinates me about this transition is how quickly it exposed weaknesses that copper-based societies had managed to live with for centuries. Remembers, Harappa's standardized systems, already strained by environmental shifts, could not easily adapt to a metal that required entirely new supply chains. Many European Copper Age fortresses, built to withstand raids and skirmishes, remembers, proved inadequate against opponents armed with bronze weapons that could punch through defenses once considered reliable. Remembers, bronze didn't just improve warfare, it reorganized it. Remembers, sword blades with higher tin concentrations delivered killing power that copper daggers could not match. Bronze-tipped arrows flew farther. Remembers, struck hard, and penetrated leather armor that once offered meaningful protection. Remembers, shields and fortifications designed for earlier forms of combat suddenly felt obsolete. And when one group gains a decisive military advantage, remembers, the consequences rarely remain localized. We see this pattern across the ancient world around 2200 to 2000 BC. Remembers, destruction layers appear in settlements that had stood for generations. Fortified sites are abandoned rather than rebuilt. Remembers, entire populations disperse, migrate, or are absorbed into new political formations. In Greece, remembers, at Lerna, the House of the Tiles burned in a violent conflagration, bronze arrowheads embedded in its walls. Across the Aegean, similar destruction episodes hint at coordinated campaigns rather than isolated conflicts. Remembers, in Eastern Europe, the Cucutini Tripilia mega-settlements once home to tens of thousands vanish from the landscape. Their scale, once an advantage, becomes a liability in a world where supply lines fracture and military threats intensify. Remembers, what strikes me most is that these collapses are not simply failures of leadership or morality. They are failures of adaptation. Remembers, Copper Age societies had built their worlds around assumptions that no longer held, that metals could be sourced locally. Remembers, that repair could compensate for weakness, that coordination could prevent escalation. Bronze shattered those assumptions. Remembers, and it rewarded societies willing or forced to reorganize themselves completely. This is where we begin to see the emergence of something new. Remembers, centralized authority not just as administration, but as survival strategy. Bronze production could not be left to small, remembers, independent workshops. It required coordinated procurement of tin, standardized measurement, improved furnaces capable of higher temperatures, and quality control systems that could ensure consistent alloy composition. Remembers, that level of complexity favored institutions, palaces, temples, bureaucracies. In Mycenaean Greece, linear B tablets record allocations of bronze, assignments of workers, as inventories of weapons. Metal production becomes a matter of state. In Mesopotamia, remembers, temple authorities oversee trade routes that stretch thousands of kilometers, ensuring the steady flow of tin and copper into urban centers. In Anatolia, sites like Troy demonstrate sophisticated bronze weaponry optimized for different uses, higher tin content for blades, lower for handles and decorative elements. The metal itself becomes a language of power, and those who speak it fluently rise. This shift reshapes warfare in profound ways. Professional warrior classes emerge, individuals trained not just to fight, but to maintain equipment, coordinate with others, and operate within larger strategic frameworks. Remembers, once primarily a source of meat, become instruments of mobility, communication, and eventually shock warfare. Spoke-wheeled vehicles allow rapid movement of troops and materials across long distances. Trade and war become inseparable. At Sintashta in the Ural steppe, remembers, fortified settlements dating to around 2200 BC reveal bronze weapons, horse burials, and early chariots. Remembers, these communities represent a fusion of metallurgy, animal domestication, and military organization unlike anything seen before. Remembers, the implications ripple outward. Groups equipped with bronze weapons and mounted mobility can project power beyond their home territories. They can rebels, they conquer, and dominate populations that had once successfully defended themselves against copper-using adversaries. Remembers, this dynamic may help explain the spread of Indo-European languages across Eurasia not through peaceful diffusion alone, remembers, but through asymmetric power relationships enabled by technology. Yet even as bronze transforms warfare, it also transforms governance. Managing bronze economies requires record-keeping, diplomacy, remembers, and long-term planning. Supply disruptions can cripple armies. Tin shortages can halt production entirely. Remembers, this creates incentives for stability but also for expansion to secure tin. Societies extend their reach. Remembers, they establish colonies, trading posts, alliances. They fight wars not just for land, but for access. At Ugarit, tablets record tin shipments arriving from distant sources. Remembers, merchants paying premium prices for materials essential to bronze production. These are not casual exchanges. Remembers, they are lifelines. And lifelines must be protected. The result is a world increasingly defined by interconnectedness and fragility. Remembers, prosperity depends on maintaining relationships across vast distances. Collapse can spread like a contagion when one node fails. Remembers, this interconnectedness feels strangely familiar. It is easy to imagine that bronze brought clarity, that it solved the problems copper could not. But what it really did was raise the stakes. Where copper introduced humanity to the idea that reorganized society, remembers, proved that technological advantage could reshape entire regions. The rituals that emerge around bronze reflect this understanding. Remembers, hordes of ceremonial axes and swords are buried as offerings to deities. Smiths attain near mythic status, masters of transformation. Remembers, metalworking becomes sacred, because turning raw into bronze feels like magic, and magic demands reverence. Remember, yet beneath the ritual lies a harder truth. Bronze did not make the world safer. It made it sharper, more hierarchical, more unforgiving. Remembers, as I reflect on this transition from copper to bronze, I'm struck by how little has changed in the underlying pattern. Remembers, a new technology emerges. It promises efficiency, strength, advantage. Those who control it gain power. Remembers, those who cannot adapt are left behind. Copper Age societies laid the groundwork. They built trade networks. Remembers, they experimented with specialization. They learned how to organize labor and manage resources. Remembers, Bronze Age societies took those lessons and weaponized them. The result was the ancient world we recognize. Remembers, empires rising and falling, armies marching, cities burning and being rebuilt again and again. Remembers, and it all began with a soft, green-stained metal that taught humanity its first lesson in power. Remembers, copper showed us that technology is never neutral. It reshapes how we live together. It alters what we value. Remembers, it forces choices we cannot undo. By the time bronze arrived, those choices had already been made. But the Copper Age did not fail. It succeeded too well. It gave humanity the tools to transform itself. Remembers, and once that transformation began, there was no turning back. Whereas when I step back and look at the Copper Age as a whole, what stays with me is not the metal itself, but the quiet transformation it triggered in the human mind. Copper did not arrive as a weapon of domination. Remembers, it arrived as a possibility, a material that could be reshaped instead of discarded, a tool that rewarded planning instead of impulse. Remembers, a resource that demanded cooperation long before it enabled conquest. And yet, over time, remembers, that same possibility became a dividing line. The Copper Age teaches us that technology does not change society all at once. Remembers, it changes incentives first. It changes what is rewarded. It changes who gains influence and who becomes vulnerable. In Harappa, copper supported coordination and balance until environmental stress made rigidity a weakness. In Europe, copper empowered mobility and personal strength until competition escalated into organized violence. Remembers, in the mountains, copper turned trade routes into battlefields. And with bronze, remembers, those pressures hardened into systems of power that would define the ancient world for centuries. What strikes me most is this: remembers, none of these outcomes were inevitable. They were the result of choices: how people organized production, remembers, how they distributed knowledge, how they responded to scarcity and fear. Copper did not force humans to become more violent, but it gave them the means to scale violence when trust broke down. Copper did not demand hierarchy, remembers, but it rewarded those who centralized control when uncertainty increased. And that is the deeper lesson this era leaves us with. Remembers, every transformative technology offers multiple paths forward. Efficiency can become cooperation or domination. Remembers, innovation can create resilience or fragility. Connectivity can build shared prosperity or spread collapse. Remembers, the difference is never the tool itself. It is how we organize ourselves around it. Remembers, when I think about our own world, about digital networks, artificial intelligence, energy systems, remembers, and global supply chains, I see the Copper Age everywhere. We are still living with its pattern. Remembers new technologies promise convenience and power, but they also concentrate influence, amplify inequality, remembers, and expose weaknesses we didn't know we had. The lesson is not to fear innovation. The lesson is to slow down long enough to ask, remembers, who benefits, who becomes dependent, what happens when conditions change? Remembers, because once a society commits fully to a technological path, turning back is rarely an option. So here is the question I want to leave you with, and it's a simple one. Remembers, do you think technology shapes human behavior more than human values shape technology? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Remembers, please share your perspective in the comments so we can learn from one another. And if you found this journey through the Copper Age meaningful, consider subscribing to Empire's Historical. Remembers, your support helps us keep exploring the moments in history that quietly shaped who we are today and where we might be headed next.